The Age of Uncertainty podcast by Nigel Baker. Playing games with Scrum.
Oh God, sorry, I was just playing this game. Welcome to the latest episode of the Age of Uncertainty podcast and the final in the series. This one is all about playing games with Scrum. So this final episode is actually based off a workshop that I've run over the last 18 or so months a couple of times at conferences around the world. The first time was at the Go-To Development Conference, I believe in Copenhagen. The second time was at Lean Agile Brighton. I have actually submitted the full presentation to the Scrum gathering in Portland, though I don't even know if I'm going to that yet. However, what I wanted to give you for this final episode is a little cut down version of that presentation. Now, the idea behind this presentation is all about playing games with Scrum. Now, what does that actually mean? Well, you could look at the term playing games in two different ways. Playing games with could mean deal with someone or something in a way that lacks due seriousness or respect, or perhaps to be evasive and deceptive, to mess around with someone's feelings, not being direct or perhaps not telling the truth. Yet playing a game can also mean something completely different, like playing a game. A game is normally some sort of activity or sport, usually involving skill, knowledge, or even a little bit of chance, in which you follow some fixed rules and try and win against an opponent or try and solve a puzzle. You know, playing, the idea of playing is engaging in activity for enjoyment and recreation, being cooperative and finding some joy in the experience. So the idea behind this workshop was to take these two different ways of referring to playing games, to be deceptive or manipulative and playing games, actually playing physical games, mashing the two ideas together in a bit of Edward de Bono style lateral thinking and see what emerges. Now, this idea of game playing as an idea in Agile is not a new one, by the way. Asda Coburn, one of the famous authors of the Agile Manifesto, actually came up with it many, many years ago. I've got this picture here from 2003 where you can see he's broken down a variety of different types of games. Infinite, finite and goal-directed, and competitive versus cooperative. And he really placed software development down in that finite and goal-directed yet cooperative space. So this idea of product development, software development being a game is actually a really interesting point of view that's been around longer than perhaps some people realise. So when I said I'm going to mash these two ideas together, sort of playing games, i.e. being deceptive, and playing games as like in playing an actual game, there is actually a third aspect to this, which is actually relating playing a game like Alistair did to the world of product development, the world of software development. So if we bring these three things together, we can get some really interesting conversations out. Now, in the original presentation, there is a huge chunk on the Nigel scale, which frankly, I'm not going to repeat again in, episode 20 odd in a 20 episode podcast. If you look back at a variety of previous episodes, the Nigel scale, scaling frameworks versus the Nigel scale, there's been a range of discussions around this model I've used again and again and again. So please feel free to jump to one of those earlier videos to get that interesting gossip. So what I'm going to pull out here is just the idea of games. And when I say games, I don't mean games. I mean old school, classic board games. Like this, Monopoly. One of the classic board games that people have played for the last 100 or so years. First invented as the landlord game, if I remember correctly, a sort of a damning indictment on the capitalist system, and these days played by kids and by adults. If I was to ask you now, have you played Monopoly? The answer is probably yes. If I was to ask you now whether you enjoyed Monopoly, the answer is probably no. Infamously, myself, my two young daughters and my wife got to day 6 of Monopoly before we effectively rage quit it because we were so tired of the game because it was going nowhere. So what is it about Monopoly? Well, what happens if you land on this square in Monopoly? Do you get all the money in the centre of the board from all the fines from Community Chest and Chance? Or does literally nothing happen when you land on this square? I'll be interesting to know in the comments what you actually do in your own houses. Because famously, free parking is a blank square. Nothing's supposed to happen. Yet a lot of people play what I would call a house rule. And this house rule is if you land on free parking, you get all the fines of the system. This isn't part of Monopoly. And in fact, by adding this little extra rule to Monopoly, you can hugely increase the swings in Monopoly. You know, you're grinding away for many hours, and yet someone lands on this square and the game gets out of kilter again. Introduce a lot of variance in the game. Correspondingly, if you land on a property and you choose not to buy it in Monopoly, what happens next? A lot of people just move on. But you're not supposed to. The entire point of Monopoly is if you land on a property, no one owns it, you choose not to buy it, it goes to auction. And this is what my family were not playing, and this is why the game took 6 blooming days. Because the idea of Monopoly is that is a key part of the rules. Don't believe me? Look in the rules right now. I'll put them on the screen right here. Here it is. There we go. See? Yet people don't play that rule. So what's the point of this, and how can we take this idea into our own world? Well, this is bending the core rules of a game can lead to unexpected consequences. You can see here by adding the free parking rule, we increase variation of deviation in the game, and that can cause us a whole heap of trouble in our lean systems, our board game development. And perhaps not playing the auction rule can actually lead us towards games that take far longer to come to resolution. So we've got to be very careful with our frameworks because there are rules in place in these models that are perhaps to encourage a behaviour or discourage a behaviour. By adding that rule, we could increase variation and perhaps deviation and get us into trouble. Or perhaps by missing a rule, we could actually end up with systems that don't reach a conclusion. We drop the product owner, we never get to say the product is done. So looking at Scrum or Kanban or XP with this point of view, with this sort of monopoly situation, varying or deviating core fundamental rules, well, as we discussed in the Nigel scale before, varying those core rules can lead to very unexpected consequences. That little butterfly of a rule variation could lead to tornadoes of consequences later. But I'm sure you've all played this game, Bake a Cake. Yeah? Yeah? No? How could you have not played this game? Invented by world famous game developers Scott Wilson and Nigel Baker. Yeah, that's me. Scott and I created this board game back, oh my god, in the early to mid 80s. We were about 8 years old. And look at the game here. Look at this wonderful, beautiful game we created. Obviously not published officially, just the two of us making it at home. We had great fun making this game. And if you look at it, it's a game about baking a cake. Who said we were original? The idea was you went around the board collecting the ingredients, and at the end you headed to the cake show. Whoever got to the cake show first won. Now, thinking about it, that isn't actually how you win cake shows. But hey ho, we were kids, we didn't really know at the time. But looking at this game again, does it seem familiar to you in any way? Yeah, as you can tell, it's basically a rip-off of Monopoly. It's like a variation on Monopoly with a little dash of Trivial Pursuit in the middle. It's not original, it's very derivative. And what's this got to do with us? Well, one of the big issues of playing games with Scrum is that a lot of people have said, oh, we've moved past Scrum. We've transcended Scrum. You know, we're post-Agile even. We've transcended these values and principles and we've moved forward. That's great if that's what they want to think. But then what do? They end up effectively doing what we did. Homebrewing their own games, developing their own agile processes that end up looking quite a lot like Scrum, just with slightly different names. Oh, we don't have a daily Scrum anymore. We have a daily huddle. And it's in the afternoon instead. And so we've got to be careful here as well. Why? Well, recreating pre-existing processes could literally be reinventing the wheel. Actually a physical waste of your time. But here's another way to look at this. We created this game, Scott and I, because his older brother, Paul, and our neighbour, Chris, they both loved making board games. And they were about 5 or 6 years older than us, so about 13. And oh my God, we idolize them. And oh my God, we love playing their board games because they would spend a lot of time designing them. And at 8 years old, this was pretty cool for us. And I remember one of the games, Cockney Werewolf in Washington, which you've never played, obviously, it was only between us, was a game where you're all private eyes trying to find a werewolf. Except one of you is secretly the werewolf. And by the way, if you've ever played the conference game Werewolf, we were not aware of it at the time. But the idea is you're all hunting down the werewolf who's one of you. The werewolf wins by killing multiple people in the game. And they do that by visiting these wonderful little houses that Chris and Paul designed. A little house with a little pool where you would see a lovely picture of domesticity, of home. And then if the werewolf enters the house, he brutally murders everyone involved. Blood, guts. Oh my God, we loved it at 8 years old. What a wonderful game. What a wonderful idea. I think the werewolf had to kill 3 people and then escape in a car. That sounds so fun. And of course, the private detectives have got to kill the werewolf. Except the first time we played that game, we realised a huge fundamental issue with the game. Why would any private eye go into any house unless they were the werewolf? There was no benefit to go in the house for anyone else. Only the werewolf needed to go in and murder. Whoops. So this is the trouble with homebrews. Homebrew games. It looks brilliant on the surface. It looks brilliant in theory. The minute you start playing it, you start realizing things are horribly, horribly wrong. This is why in the games world, one of the absolute critical things is playtesting. Again and again and again. And not just the designers playing the games, civilians, real people playing the games. And that gives you genuine good feedback on whether the rules hold together or whether they don't. And my concern is with a lot of homebrew methods, hell, with a lot of officially sold methods out in industry, they are playtesting it. But they're playtesting it on you and on your careers. And that's a bit deadly. Because you're the one who suffers the consequences. You're the one who gets the mass redundancy because we don't see the value in this thing anymore. And the developers of that framework just look and go, whoops, perhaps should we tweak it? Well, they can tweak it, but you've smashed your career perhaps. And that's a concern. It's why I quite like frameworks like Scrum, XP, Kanban. Now, you may not like them, you may like them, you may develop up your own approaches, but these things have been play tested. They've been battle hardened. They've had all the edges and side things knocked off them through lots of experience in different communities. So there's a lot of robustness to some of these techniques. And compare that to some of the big meta patterns, like, for instance, the Scaled Agile framework and things like that, which they haven't been battle tested. Where they have, they've fallen to pieces almost completely. I'm just worried about that. And if we take that sort of as a game design, that would be like launching a massive new, huge blockbuster game to market that doesn't even work when you launch. Oh wait, I can think of a few of those in the computer game world as well. So look at these 2 games here. I've got Settlers of Catan and Ticket to Ride. These are both very famous, very recognisable, very popular games. Now, Catan I own, but still haven't opened yet. Sorry, sister-in-law, for buying it for me. I will get there eventually. But Ticket to Ride is a game we play in our house all the time, and it's brilliant. Why is it brilliant? Because it's really, really got an essence of some quite clear rules that allow great complexity and tactics within it. So every game's different. You never play the same game twice. This is really popular in our house with both the adults and the children. That for me is a really good game. A game that has some clear rules that allow great complexity within the rules rather than making a very, very over-complex game. Because if you look at things like, I don't know, Pokemon or Magic the Gathering, very, very popular games. I'm afraid to say I was a bit old when they came out to start playing them. But the trouble with these games is the complexity breeds complexity. You have all these separate little special rules, and how they interact or don't interact with each other can end up with a lot of unintended consequences. And they end up with what they call in the computer game world nerfing, where people have to effectively patch the games after they've launched them because people have found these unexpected consequences of a combination of these highly complex rules. It's why we've always said, KISS, keep it simple, Scrum Masters. You want to keep your rule set quite simple, your framework rule set for quite simple for the world of work, so you don't get a load of strange, unintended complexities and consequences coming out of your world of work. That's why you often hear chess used as an example for Scrum. Simple to understand, but still hard to master. Paul Goddard, a friend of mine, he uses a deck of cards as an example. Deck of cards is such a simple tool, yet you can play many games with it. In fact, you can play many different games with it. And I think I've heard if you shuffle a deck of cards, because of the number of cards, there has never actually been that order of cards ever before in the history of the world, or ever will again in the history of playing cards. Oh my gosh, a simple set of rules can still give you a great area of complexity to play in, and perhaps allow you to harness a great amount of complexity with a few simple rules. I think that is what some things like Scrum and Kanban are trying to get to. And as I raise my mighty level 3 broadsword to strike with a spell of heavy lifting against the orc over... I mock, but actually I love Dungeons and Dragons and Warhammer Fantasy Battle. I don't know if you've played these games. I think Warhammer Fantasy Battle is now of the past, but I loved playing it back in the 1990s, the same as Dungeons and Dragons. These were games that were world building. Especially Dungeons and Dragons. It was a cooperative game. You're working together. You are the fighter. You are the wizard. I am the cleric. You are the elf. And together we work to fight evil, to discover treasure, cooperative storytelling, cooperative role-playing. I think if we ever wanted a game that's closest to the world of software development, it's probably something like Dungeons and Dragons. And I don't mean slightly male-dominated, weird and wonderful jargon. What I mean is just this idea of working cooperatively in a game to achieve some joy or achieve some success at it. Now, here's the issue with these types of games. Like, I used to play a lot of Warhammer Fantasy Battle when I was a young boy.
Blood for the blood god, skulls for the skull's throne.
And the trouble with Fantasy Battle was I never lost a battle. I had some armies, I had an army of the undead, and I never lost. I never lost. The entire time I was playing, I never lost. And it was joyless. Because the minute you keep winning, you have to keep winning. And I would always search the rules, search out the nuances to try and find some tricks, some gimmicks to help me achieve the next success. My friends, who lost a lot, had a wonderful time. Not through losing, just they played the game in the right way. They played the game with the right mythos. They picked armies that suited the storyline of that army, when I picked armies to win. I thought I was being clever. I was not. In the end, I stopped playing because the tension of trying to win too much just got too much. The joy of the game fell away. And I think that's why it's important to play all of this with the spirit of the game. You may have heard that term in terms of cricket or in rugby, but these types of cooperative games, these explorative games, these creative games work best when they're played with the right spirit. That often means you need someone to help you play with the right spirit. And I don't mean a referee or an umpire. I mean in terms of Dungeons and Dragons, it's called the Dungeon Master. And that's what we're looking for. Someone to play Dungeon Master in our experience. Now, whether it's Scrum Master or whatever you want to call the job title, I think having someone there whose job it is not to be the rule smith, not to be the opponent like a traditional manager supervising, but to be a catalyst of the game, to be someone who helps create the world the game is built in, to help create the right environment for great gameplay to occur, to create the right mythos, to create the right attitude and culture. That's what a good Scrum Master does. Dungeon Mastering. What a strange title. Much like Scrum Master. However, and by the way, isn't it interesting how the two are related? I don't know if you know this, but there's no connection between Dungeon Master and Scrum Master. Oh, but I wish there was. If you call it Scrum Master or don't call it Scrum Master, I really don't care. As Shakespeare said, a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. It doesn't matter what it's called, but having someone taking on that position to be that world builder, that culture, that enabler, that coach, that facilitator is absolutely critical. I see a lot of lip service to Scrum Mastery in 2023. I see Scrum organizations deleting Scrum Masters all over the place and creating these higher level roles. Higher level or less helpful? You decide. But I don't think it's a good pattern. I don't think it's something we should support. Because me, I love playing games. I love playing games. Not deceiving, not lying, not tricking people. I love playing games. And what do I hate more than anything in the world? Rule breakers. Now, When we talk in Agile about rule breakers, I'm not talking about people who experiment, people who stretch the boundaries. That's what you want in our world. If you notice, the world of Agile is full of those slight rebels. What I mean is cheats. And we get cheats in the world of work. People who break a rule. They break it deliberately. We see it again and again, more so 10 years ago than now. We see these people malforming Scrum or malforming some other technique and getting malformed results. But what we see a lot in the world of Agile today is what we call in the world of poker, angle shooting. Now, I love the game of poker, and angle shooting isn't cheating, right? Because in the world of poker, you hide 3 aces up your sleeve. Well, in the old days, in the Wild West, it would literally got you shot. But there is this idea in the game of poker of angles. This is when you bend the rules slightly to your advantage. You're not cheating, you're not pulling a card out of your sleeve, but you're manipulating your understanding of the rules to achieve slightly better results. And we see a lot of this, not just in people on Scrum teams, the people around teams, the managers, the bosses, the supervisors, the Agile coaches, the Scrum masters perhaps, bending the rules to their advantage. We've got to watch out for this. I think we need to play these games with the right spirit. Without the right spirits, you get bending and manipulation, and that can only lead to bad results. And in the actual conference presentation, we explored this a bit more in terms of the Nigel scale. So we started talking about Monopoly being a bit about varying core practices and how that can get you into trouble. We talked about how things like Catan and Ticket to Ride, that was about understanding tactics within the game, which is different to rules of the game. Tactics are kind of like Nigel scale 2, good practice, but the rules of the game are like the core fundamentals that you mustn't bend. We discussed how some people seem to think rules are all you need. You don't need any tactics within games. Those are people we like to call in the gaming world losers. But some people also who think everything's a tactic, including bending and breaking those rules. Yeah, and you're right, that gets us into a lot of trouble. So I quite like this metaphor of like a board game or a game as a metaphor for frameworks. And I quite like the idea of looking for people who play games with their frameworks and manipulate them in the wrong ways, and can see perhaps how that doesn't lead to the best results. It may lead to a good today, but it can definitely lead to bad products and a bad tomorrow. And that's the end. Welcome to the end of the season, okay, of the Age of Uncertainty podcast, the end of season 2. Now, is there going to be a season 3? Well, I don't know. I thoroughly enjoy doing these videos. I have a great time doing them. They really do scratch an itch I can't fulfill any other way. But the viewing figures are not exactly smashing box office records. So I have got to make some hard decisions about whether there's going to be a season 3 later in the year. Give me some feedback if you want it. Please spread these videos. Subscribe. Why? Because there'll be new videos eventually, and then you won't forget to go back and watch all the other great videos from the last 2 years. So please still subscribe and listen out. I am going to put more things on this channel. The one thing I will promise you is there's going to be a special at the end of the year. Now, whether it's a Christmas special, whether it's a Halloween special, whether I'm brave and try and do both, we will see. But that's my promise to you. That's my forecast of the future. Though notice, I'm not making a commitment. Why not? Oh boy, there's a lot of things between now and then. But the music's starting, so one final time this season, thank you so much, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye.